The internet has changed. I mean, I'm definitely dating myself here, but you already know that I am a decrepit husk, and I am praying that some sort of distorted anti-age beauty serum is invented within my lifetime. Webcomics. These comics were a window into geek culture and internet camaraderie of a time long past. When you think of webcomics, the idea of stereotypical gamer slop of two misanthropes grousing about AAA titles comes to mind. But we also have plenty of webcomics that can hold a candle to their comic store contemporaries. When I was a teen, I spent a good chunk of my leisure time reading relatable comics about gamers in idealized adult living situations. I may have even tried my hand at writing and drawing one of those, but I've made sure that will never see the light of day. Behind every comic is a creative voice. Webcomics are often a one or two person effort, and as such, they tend to have pretty distinctive creative voices. The author can ensure that they're telling the story that they want to tell, that they can use their favorite jokes, and they can draw what they intended without the interference of a publisher or editor. This can be for better or for worse, and sometimes those creators' ambitions can get the very best of them. Today, we'll be looking at some past webcomic authors, exploring their rise to prominence and their gradual fade from notoriety. Frederick Gallagher III is a webcomic author and artist from Ann Arbor, Michigan. Fred is the co-creator and artist of the manga-inspired Megatokyo. Fred was inspired by the works of Studio Key, a Japanese visual novel developer behind series like Canon and Angel Beats. He wanted to tell stories with emotional resonance, romance, and melodrama. Fred would begin his work as an illustrator by doing art for his sister's children's book, The Fine Red Cat. Fred would link up with then-collaborator Rodney Caston to develop a webcomic together. At the time, Rodney was acting as the chief writer of the comic, with Fred co-writing and doing the art. During his time on the comic, Megatokyo was a zany series about two expats who are trapped in Japan and eventually get pulled into a world of military intrigue, hacker plots, crazy battles, and whirlwind romances. Although dated now, Megatokyo was something of a bridge between webcomic readership and the anime and manga fandom. It bridged a gap between deep weebdom of visual novels, Toho, and arcades, while also presenting the gamer webcomic tropes of the time, like madcap humor, leet speak, and PC gaming gatekeeping. Caston's self-insert Largo was more akin to the characters from Penny Arcade or Apple Geeks. Fred's insert, Pyro, was more like the sardonic, world-weary, but romantically minded protagonists of seinen manga at the time. The two of them were complementary and navigated the world of Megatokyo, facing new challenges, mysterious adversaries, and more, all in an effort to head home. As the comic progressed, the two creators would gradually drift apart, with Fred wanting to continue dramatic storytelling inspired by those visual novels, while Caston wanted the comic to remain an irreverent, fish-out-of-water comedy. The two would split up, with Fred securing Caston's share of the comic. Rodney Caston would shift his focus, having a fruitful career in cybersecurity, and then eventually moving towards a career in politics, joining the Libertarian Party. Maybe fruitful's not the right word. Fred would assert full control of the comic with some input by guest comic contributor Dominic Nguyen and his wife Sarah. Fred would do exactly what he planned on, pivoting to drama and romance, with Largos taking a major backseat to Pyro. With this shift in tone, Fred would also demonstrate one of his biggest failings as a creator, his time management. The comic would go months, and even years without updates, with Fred supplementing this with his infamous Dead Pyro art days, when he would post work-in-progress art in place of comics, and would trot out a new excuse for these delays. And his artwork would do little to progress. Fred would split his focus between the comic and his side project entitled Warmth. This was a moody multimedia project leaning even further into his visual novel influences. Around this time, the formerly import-only visual novels Key and other developers made would receive officially translated Steam releases. They would become far more accessible than they ever were, and would have successful anime adaptations.
Be sure to watch out for cars now.
This bears mention, as many readers of Megatokyo read it in place of visual novels and manga. Megatokyo's inception would take place while anime and manga in the West was still a developing market. As we know now, anime and manga is a mammoth media presence, routinely outselling traditional comics from major publishers like Marvel, DC, and Dark Horse. Megatokyo's fans would dwindle, with many becoming fatigued by the long waits and choosing manga over Fred's ersatz Webcomic, or aging out of webcomics in general. Megatokyo's readership would become exclusively made up by hardcore fans. Despite these negative trends, Fred would not see this as a reason to change or to motivate himself, and instead continued to update sparsely while starting half-baked side projects. The art was rough and did not warrant these long breaks. The humor remained stiff and dated, with Fred still using leet-speak and IIRC-influenced humor well after those trends and demographics ran their course. The characters were flatly developed and were bland anime archetypes, all infatuated with Fred's self-insert. Despite Megatokyo's influence on webcomics, it would stand as a dated relic of a bygone era. Comics like Penny Arcade and Ctrl+Alt+Delete would end and reboot. By the time Fred would even get chapters out, his peers would move on to working in the comic industry or in video games, philanthropy, and other avenues, while Fred continued to scrawl and doodle with pencil on inkjet paper. Fred was being left in the past, and even worse, he was blissfully unaware of how dated and lousy his webcomic had gotten. Whatever happened to Megatokyo would prove a common question on discussion forums. Fred took a major step to rejuvenate the brand, promoting a Kickstarter for a Megatokyo visual novel. This felt like what he wanted to do his entire life, making a visual novel that could measure up to his influences and live beyond his past work in webcomics. The time was right, with many people looping around from their fatigue with Fred's procrastination to being nostalgic for the comic they grew up with. Fred's Kickstarter would exceed expectations, and Fred began to work on this new chapter in his franchise. This, however, would not be the case at all. Fred's habitual procrastination would rear its ugly head, with him making yet another side project. Updates on the Megatokyo visual novel would slow to a glacial crawl, with years passing with no substantial information, despite the Kickstarter being backed to the tune of $300,000. Good God. Fred's last update on this visual novel was June of 2017, and it has remained dormant ever since. More than anything, Fred was often his own worst enemy. He removed the person who kept him accountable and on schedule from the project. He leaned into influences and appealed to himself, rather than writing a comic with his fans in mind, continually betraying the trust and devaluing the time of his core fanbase, and never improving his art or trying to grow as an artist and as a writer. He had such devoted fans that they were willing to give him over $250,000 to make a Ren P game, and he couldn't commit to that. He had the support of fans, friends, and his wife, but chose to continue putting out nothing. Fred is a cautionary tale of an extremely successful person who refused to invest in himself. A king who allowed his cape to fray and tatter, his throne to become decrepit, and his crown to be caked in lime and rust. It's over, Fred-chan. Hang it up. Scott Ramsoomair is a Canadian webcomic author and writer best known for his webcomic series VG Cats. He started VG Cats in 2001 as a hobby while at his day job. He would draw sketches during his lunch hour and refine them into realized comics. VG Cats centered around two gamer felines, Leo and Eris, who would deal with comedic scenarios related to video games and gaming culture of the time. The two had an all-too-familiar dynamic where Leo was a dim-witted and infantile comedic relief character, and Eris was the cynical, frustrated, and clever foil to his antics. Think Pinky and the Brain, but Brain isn't a genius and he has tits. Actually, don't think about the brain with tits. Ramsoomair worked diligently on the comic to meet his Monday schedule. Updated Mondays was a promise that Scott kept to his audience for many years. It may have been up on Monday at 12 a.m., 5 a.m., or 10 p.m., but it would be out on a Monday. Scott's character's personality and commitment to his fans culminated in the comic gaining a very dedicated fandom. Scott would build an audience that really loved what he did with these characters. From his more slice-of-life comics, his non-sequitur gags featuring lol-so-random character Pants Man, timely parodies of beloved video game franchises like Zelda, Mario, Final Fantasy, and others, even times where he would develop the characters in backstory about Leo and Eris's childhood. Scott effectively embodied the 2000s gamer culture in a sincere way. He would write a dynamic that felt wacky but less rigid. His fans loved the irreverent style that Scott brought to readers weekly. Scott was especially great at interacting with his fans. He would post art and do blog posts frequently, he would eagerly speak with fans that he came across, and he would attend conventions like Anime North and Fan Expo as an artist vendor. Scott would share his influences, he'd talk about his life, and connect with his audience in a meaningful fashion. Scott was also a major contributor to Penny Arcade's Child's Play charity event, auctioning off original artwork for proceeds to go to Toronto's Sick Kids Hospital. By 2007, Scott would have nearly 200 issues of VG Cats on the website, and was in the talks about an online animated adaptation, which would eventually be put on hiatus. Scott released a trade hardcover entitled VG Cats Volume 1, featuring some of the comics with older comics having remastered artwork and touch-ups. Scott had his fair share of critics, but he was able to carve out a comfortable niche in webcomics, poking away at consistent updates for over 10 years. With time, Scott would get married, his comic work would ebb and flow with these new responsibilities. This was the case until his life was turned upside down. Scott's wife would file for divorce, gaining custody of their children and in receipt of child support from Scott. Making these payments proved very difficult for Scott. He was facing financial struggle on a month-to-month basis. During this, his comic updates crawled to a glacial pace, with comics coming out on a yearly basis. Scott routinely evaded drawing any suggestive art of the characters, often pressured by his inevitable furry fanbase. But Scott became extremely desperate. Around 2018, Scott would start the now lost Patreon, VG Ludes, where he would draw the duo from the comic in suggestive and sexual situations. Initially, Scott would receive a deluge of commissions from people who wanted to see some pink cat. It's gross, don't make me say it. This would come to an abrupt end when Scott's artwork was met with harsh critique from patrons. Many of these people came to the conclusion that Scott was not very good at drawing porn. Scott would respond extremely poorly to this criticism, halting any work on previously commissioned artwork, blocking commissioners asking about pending artwork, and eventually closing down the Patreon and ceasing communication through the VG Ludes Twitter account. Scott would seemingly vanish from the internet, but would attempt different projects, receiving pushback from his fans. During this time, Scott would allegedly attempt suicide. In 2022, Scott would delete everything and post a now-deleted Patreon update saying that he intended on ending the comic. Fans would assume the worst given Scott's past ideations, but Scott would bring back the comic in 2023 with some very sporadic updates. Following this, Scott would post on 4chan's Comics and Cartoons board, verifying his identity with some exclusive sketches and fulfilling sketch requests. Scott updates the comic occasionally, and is also making some very unremarkable music with AI art music covers. Personally, I've always been pretty mixed on Scott, but I was a reader of his for a long time. Is the comic good? Not really. But the heart shines through. You get a cheap laugh, or you feel like you're just happy something this silly and fun could exist. Revisiting VG Cats for this section was mixed, as I realized the things that made me howl at age 13 really have not held up. But it also made me happy to consider why I enjoyed this comic. And despite his controversies, despite his challenges, Scott brought a lot of people some laughs and a comic to look at every Monday. Tim Buckley is the creator of the eternally maligned, but once popular bland video game webcomic, Ctrl+Alt+Del. Tim Buckley also shares the same name as the legendary singer-songwriter Tim Buckley, so researching this goober took some time. I am going to have a very hard time being objective during this part. Buckley, occasionally going by his online moniker Absath, was an artist who would often draw fantasy and comic fan art prior to his starting CAD. Ctrl+Alt+Del follows a pair of avid gamers, Ethan and Lucas. They deal with different issues, talk video games, and crack wise. Ethan is a dim-witted, selfish man-child who, despite his utter incompetence and lack of real-life experience, owns a house and has a girlfriend, the utterly unrealistic Lila. He is also a genius mechanical engineer who built a sentient robot out of an original Xbox, even though he works at a GameStop and cannot make a grilled cheese. This may seem like me going full, actually, but I hate this stupid moron and his dumb B over you face. Lucas is a cynical know-it-all jackass who acts like the voice of reason for Ethan, but is typically just a really bland jerk. The duo, along with Lila, Zeke the robot, and that guy who likes Linux, who is never funny or used properly, go through misadventures and hijinks. For a better outline of the comic proper, check out the video by my good pal Club Doom. Me, I am here to talk about Bum Tickley. Tim would continue the comic, which would frequently be compared unfavorably to the far more popular, better drawn, and sometimes actually funny Penny Arcade. Tim would resent this, especially the comparison to fellow gaming comic PvP. Tim posted about small comic creators being insignificant and how they would not survive without their mouths surgically attached to PvP artist Scott Kurtz's cock. Tim would go so far as to edit the PvP Wikipedia entry and replace all the text with PvP sucks. This was confirmed when a fan cross-referenced IPs from an email they received from Tim in the IP that he used to make these edits. Buckley was frequently called out for his art process, where he would have a page of fully drawn assets like eyes, mouths, expressions, and bodies that he would recycle and edit very lazily. Tim would also become shockingly litigious about a young fan drawing Ethan in a piece of very amateurish fan art, and would include a rant about copyright law and original IP ownership, despite writing a comic about various other IPs that features a talking Microsoft console. If I haven't made it clear at this point, Tim Buckley is an asshole. He is a petty, unlikable, very short, and very weak little man who draws worse than the literal child who drew fan art of his bland character. In the early 2000s, mediocrity was celebrated, and guys like Buckley could succeed because they were consistent and nothing more. The art was stiff, ugly, and often featured Google images with a blur filter as backgrounds. He plagiarized character designs despite getting adamant about no one redrawing his characters. And then there's Jackie. Allegations came out that Tim Buckley was communicating with a supposed minor, only known as Jackie. A post on a blog spot outlined this flashing of a dick pic to the alleged minor, sending his face and thirst trap pictures prior to an image with her name written above his half-mast, very tiny penis. Buckley himself would admit to this via his public Wikipedia account, responding to Wikipedia stubs asking if he knew Jackie, responding that he did, and that he showed her his penis. In the year of our Lord, 2008, you could be a complete piece of shit with no consequences because people liked your very unfunny comic. These allegations are still very much up in the air to this day if Jackie was in fact a minor or not, but given Buckley's track record, I would not be shocked. Buckley allegedly auctioned off a previous drawing tablet. It was implied that the auctioned funds would go to charity, but he allegedly kept this money and used it to purchase a $2,500 Wacom Cintiq. Buckley would be heckled and mocked for his subpar comic up until a certain point where the mockery would become infamy. Following a story where Lila shared that she was pregnant with Ethan's child, there would be a comic that would forever tarnish the already bland and terrible legacy of Tim Buckley. Loss. The comic would show Ethan rushing to Lila's side after a medical emergency to find her curled up sobbing after suffering a miscarriage. A miscarriage is a painful, heart-wrenching loss for any woman to endure, leading to years of trying to live beyond the loss and trauma. To carry a child and to lose it is a pain that no one should ever have to face in life. Something that even following support, love, and healing, even other opportunities to start a family afterwards, can linger for a woman's entire life. So, the comic about how certain video games suck and how losing at Halo freaking bites, dude, really was not the medium to talk about something this serious. Tim's depiction of miscarriage was so juvenile and silly that 4chan, NeoGAF, Reddit, and other groups and artists would mock it for years and years to come, with lost memes made to this very day. Tim would eventually end the comic, with Ethan dying and his friends starting a cult around his image, a very bizarre way to wrap it up. Tim eventually rebooted the comic with admittedly improved art, and would start a Kickstarter to compile a hardcover omnibus series of the last decade of CAD, also known as CAD 1.0. This would be funded and then some, making $700,000, showing that there is no God, and we live in a hellish nightmare world. Presently, Tim is continuing to draw Ctrl+Alt+Delete with weird Merryweather Comics looking pseudo-anime art, which is also still ass, but considerably better than his previous work. He's done side comics, including a spin-off alternate continuity where Ethan and Lucas are superheroes called Analog and D-Pad, and a sci-fi comic called The Star Chaser Chronicles. Ctrl+Alt+Delete, now 22 years old, is sadly here to stay, with Tim streaming on Twitch and persisting in making some of the most mediocre to bad webcomic hackery ever. I wanted to do this video for quite a while. I hope that you guys enjoyed it. I pray to the slug god that you like and subscribe. I don't want to be one of those "it really helps with the algorithm" guys, but I guess it does. I don't get this stupid website. I'm just trying to make some videos and make you guys laugh. Thank you for being here till the very end. And of course, slugs never die.